So if we're talking about the law of detachment, okay, this first guy here, basically what it is if we have a conditional statement, what's a conditional? If then, right? So if we have an if then statement, the conditional is true, okay? So if my if then statement is a true statement, and then they tell me that the hypothesis, what's the hypothesis? So this is basically saying if P then Q is true, what's the hypothesis of our conditional? Is it the P or the Q?
The Q.
That's P. The conclusion, P. So now they're saying the hypothesis, the P portion is true. Then we're going to make the conclusion that the conclusion is true, okay? Our Q portion will be true. So here's how we break it down a little nicer. This right here is just saying what this said, okay? It's just a repeat, but in symbol form. Here it is. If your if P then Q statement is true, and then they tell you that the P portion is true, you will make the conclusion that the Q portion is true. Okay, now that maybe sounds a little confusing because we're talking in letters, but let me show you in words and in statements, and I think it'll make more sense. Okay. Are you ready? Are you hearing me?
Wait, I think I need a little break.
No break. We just started. So it says use the law of detachment to make a conclusion. Okay? Hear this. I'm going to highlight it for you to show you the different pieces. This says if a student gets an A on a final exam, then the student will pass the course. Okay? That is your if P, then Q, right? If a student gets an A on the final exam, then the student will pass the course. And we're saying that's a true statement. If you get an A on the final, you're going to pass, okay? The next statement...
No, that's not true.
No, we're saying it is true. I'm saying if, like, would be if Mrs. Verhoeven said, if we get an A on the informal geometry final, she will pass us, right? I'm telling you that's the truth. Okay, so look at this next statement. We said if P then Q is true, right, up here, if P then Q is true, and then if they say that the P, the hypothesis, is true, let's check that. Is Susie got an A on her final? Does that match up with this? Or does that match up with this?
P.
The P. If she gets an A on the final exam, Susie got an A on the final exam, right?
And Susie passed history.
So this is your P, right? So your conclusion is Susie passed history.
Wow. This is so easy.
Right? Isn't that beautiful?
Like
Why do you feel like a first grader?
like a first grader.
Geometry does this, not just informal. You guys are doing all the same things geometry does. Do you know that? Like, these are the things I teach them too. Stop devaluing yourself.
Be like the opposite.
Yeah.
So would Q would be like if you have a license, and then P would be then you can legally drive a car.
No.
Wait, so it's
So this is different. Listen. If this isn't what you're given, so if they say P then Q is true, and then they tell you the conclusion is true, you have to say not possible. Okay? And let me give you the example here where this works. This one says, if you have a license, it's not a highlighter. If you have a license, then you can legally drive a car. And then it says you drove to the store. Does that match up with orange or purple?
What? It matches up with purple.
You can drive a car, you drove to the store, right? That's saying the driving part is what happened. Right. But here's the deal. If I make the statement, if you have a license, then you can legally drive to the store. And I say, Dakota drove to the store today. Does that mean Dakota has her license?
Yeah, no, she could have a permit.
No, she could have a permit. She could have nothing. Want to hear a story? My mom, at 14 years old, now granted, she lived in a small town, with like no
Did
stoplights,
she live in
farm,
Chicago?
no, Ripon.
No, you know Ross drives
But this is what would happen with her. Her dad was a smoker, and he'd run out of cigarettes, and he'd be like, Vicky, take the car, go uptown to the drugstore, give him this note that says my daughter may buy cigarettes, and buy me a pack of cigarettes and drive home. She was 14. No, it was not legal.
No, like you could give him.
Oh yeah, he did, but it's not legal, right? Things have changed.
But they,
that wouldn't even work nowadays.
No, it wouldn't. Right, things are definitely different. But look at the situation. If P, then Q, and they told us Q was true. We have to say it is not possible to make the conclusion that that person has a license, right? You can drive illegally. It can happen. It's not wise, but it can happen, okay? So just pay attention to that. There's two different scenarios, okay? These are your two scenarios. This one, hey, with me. This one is the where it works out, lays out nicely, right?
Yeah, I got my license before.
Aren't you like 20?
This one,
Drove through someone one time.
You're 17?
Yeah.
That's crazy. When's your birthday?
okay? Hey, we're not talking about that right now. We're doing math. You guys are not getting your other things. So the orange, okay, that's when it works out nicely and we make a conclusion. The teal is if they tell you if P then Q, but then they give you the Q part, right? They give you the then portion. You cannot just assume that the if is true, right? Think about it this way. Your mom says, if you clean your room, then I'll buy you ice cream. And then the next day, you ate ice cream. Does that mean you cleaned your room? No, because maybe your dad bought you ice cream, or maybe your friend gave you ice cream at school, right? There's other ways you could get ice cream, or you snuck in and stole it, okay?
We have ice cream.
Okay, so that's the first one. We'll do more of those in the homework, and I will help you through where you need the help, but we're going to move on to the next one. Okay, this one is Law of Syllogism. Can anyone tell me what the transitive property says? Remember the transitive property? Does anyone remember it? If A equals B, remember if A equals B and B equals C, then what?
A equals C.
Then A equals C, right? We took the two out of the middle that were the same. That's what Law of Syllogism does. It says if P then Q, if Q then R, take out the Q's and you will conclude if P then R, okay? So here's what you do with this. You're just gonna get rid of.
I already know it. Like I can write the you conclude.
Good, just a second. You're just gonna get rid of the two hypotheses and conclusions that match, okay? So it says if a figure is a square, then the figure is a rectangle. If a figure is a rectangle, then the figure has four sides. What are the two things that are talking about the same part?
Rectangle.
The rectangle, right? I showed you in my color coding. So you get rid of them. And the statement you're left with is your conclusion as long as it's an if-then statement. So is this an if-then statement when all is said and done?
Yes.
What does it say?
If the figure is a square, then it has four sides.
If a figure is a square, then it has four sides. Okay, that's the law of syllogism. It's the transitive property. Take out the two things that are the same and see what you're left with. If it makes an if-then statement, you're golden. Write the statement. But what if it doesn't?
Like for example B.
Look at example B. If you do gymnastics, then you are flexible. If you do ballet, then you are flexible. What's the same?
Flexible.
Flexible. So if we take the same things out, what are we left with?
If you do gymnastics, if you do ballet.
Is that a statement that makes any sense?
No.
No. So if you don't get an if-then statement, you have to say this is not possible to make a conclusion. Okay? So look for the things that are the same, get rid of them, and see what you're left with.
I feel like I'd try to find a way to make it make sense. Like I would try to like cross out one of the ballet things or like one of the
Mhm.
six.
I feel like you would get it wrong.
Okay, next
I
one.
like that too.
If a whole number is divisible by 10, then it's divisible by 5. If a whole number ends in 0, then it's divisible by 10.
That doesn't make sense.
What can you conclude?
Even when it's
I can't do that one.
Because 2 tens.
Not possible.
Cross out the 2 tens.
Not
What?
If a whole
It
number
goes like
ends
10.
in
If a whole number ends in 0, like 60, right? Then it's divisible by 10. 200, it's divisible by 10. Anything that ends in 0 is divisible by 10.
But you don't cut anything out because nothing matches.
Oh, but
The
does
tens
some,
match. The tens
ah,
match.
the 10s match. Okay, so look,
And you have 5.
if a whole number is divisible by 10, then it is divisible by 10, right? Those are the same thing. Divisible by 10, divisible by 10. So get rid of them. What are you left with?
If a whole number ends in 0, then it is divisible by 5.
Yes.
True, right? It's an if-then statement. If a whole number ends in 0, then it is divisible by 5. Guys, you don't even need to think about does it make sense on these. If it's an if-then, you are allowed to assume that your if-thens are both true. And if those are both true, the law says if there are two things that are the same, take them out, and what you're left with will be a true statement. Okay? So this one would be if a whole number ends in 0, then it's divisible by 5. Okay, if a whole number ends in 0, then it is divisible by 5. Questions on that?
Is it okay? I always do this. When I write like divisible, I always write the dividing sign and then BLE. Does that make if it makes sense to me?
Divisible?
Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, last one. And this one's tough. These are hard. I don't make you do these on a quiz or a test, but I just want you to try it
You
because
should.
it's good for you. This one
That's basically
takes,
That offended my feelings.
listen, this one takes syllogism and detachment. Okay, both of the laws that we talked about, and it puts them together. Okay, so look at your statement. First one,
Cadence.
are we good?
She looked at me and she started laughing.
I saw that.
It hurt.
Say something like,
Whoa,
Isaiah-
Cadence.
apologize, Cadence.
Are we ready now?
I am.
Okay, if you live in Cerritos, and you guys, honestly,
It's a little bit short on your ankles. Maybe it's because you're sitting down.
why do we care right now?
I rolled them up.
Forrest, you don't need to change your pants because,
I can change who I am. Because
oh my goodness. Okay, here it is. I'm gonna color code and we're gonna talk through. Starting with the first two statements. Shh. Here it is. If you live in Cerritos,
Does James live in the USA?
then you live in California. If you live in California, then you live in the US. Okay? Don't even worry about the next statement yet. We want to simplify these two first.
If you
What-
live in Cerritos, then you live in the US.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to get rid of the two that are the same. California, California. So our new statement is if you live in Cerritos, then you live in the US. Okay, so we just did law of syllogism.
It could be Cerritos in a different.
Now detachment,
Yeah, but, like, what if there's
right.
Cerritos
We're
in-
pretending there is no other Cerritos. But yes, technically,
Actually, in Colombia and Mexico, they have other places.
In Colombia and Mexico? I don't think Colombia
They
and
have
Mexico.
places called.
Colombia.
anyway, so now it says if you live in
They
Cerritos,
both have
They're
places.
two different things.
Gentlemen.
They both have that.
Okay, you can argue all you want about it later.
Stupid.
We're gonna do this
Why
now.
can't we do, if you live in
Also
California,
in
then you live in
Ontario
the US?
and Canada.
You didn't know.
Cause we got rid of the two in the middle that were the same,
Okay.
right?
Oh, I'm saying-
California's gone now. So now we're saying if you live in Cerritos, then you live in the US. James lives in Cerritos, you conclude
James lives in the US.
James lives in the US.
Or Colombia or Mexico or.
What's
Okay,
example?
get over it, please.
So if P then Q, and they told us P was true, so we are gonna say Q is true, okay?
The next one? Oh, wait.
Do you want?
We're not doing, the rest of those notes, 2.5 and 2.6, we're not doing.
Oh,
We're just stopping at 2.4.
We're not doing. So we have time for.
It's hurdle time?
I mean, it is hurdle time.
I don't know, I'm kind of annoyed, cause you guys just
Do you have a cadence?
try to